The tire tracks disappeared where the asphalt turned to gravel, but the blood trail continued for another 40 yards into the laurel thickets. Sheriff Bobby Hutchins crouched beside the crimson spatters on November 15, 1979, watching his breath fog in the mountain air while something rustled deeper in the hollow. The abandoned Buick sat with its driver's door hanging open like a broken wing, keys still dangling from the ignition, purse untouched on the passenger seat, radio crackling with static from the valley below. What bothered Hutchins most wasn't the blood or the missing person. It was the footprints circling the vehicle. Bare feet, at least 6 different sizes, pressed into the soft earth around the car, like they'd been examining their catch. The locals had warned him about Ridge Road when he took the job 3 months earlier. Never drive it in fog, they said. That's when the Tates come down from the mountain. But Hutchins was from Knoxville, didn't believe in mountain superstitions. Until Margaret Crowley's morning commute ended in the laurel with only bloody footprints to mark her passing. Mountain folk don't speak plainly about evil. They wrap it in caution passed down through generations like recipes for cornbread or instructions for reading weather. In Bledsoe County, Tennessee, the warnings about Ridge Road dated back to the settling, when Cherokee still walked the old traces and white men built their first cabins in the shadow of Cumberland Gap. Don't travel the ridge in fog. Don't stop for strangers after dark. Don't follow lights that dance between the trees. By 1979, most people treated these warnings like old wives' tales, stories to frighten children into good behavior. But the older residents, the ones who remembered when coal trains still ran through Whisper Hollow and timber crews worked the high country, they knew better. They knew about vehicles found empty on the mountain roads, doors open, engines still running. They knew about hikers who vanished between one switchback and the next, leaving only scattered gear and sometimes, if you knew where to look, traces of something much worse. The Tate family had lived in the high country longer than anyone could remember. Even the Cherokee spoke of them in hushed tones, calling them the hungry ones, the people who forgot how to be people. Their homestead sat in a natural bowl 3 miles up an unnamed creek, accessible only by deer paths and logging traces that wound through stands of old-growth chestnut and hemlock. No road led there. At least, no road that appeared on any county map. From the courthouse records in Pikeville, property deed unclear. Survey of 1861 lists the Tate holding as inaccessible by conventional means. Old-timers in Bledsoe County measured distances differently than flatland people. They spoke of places being a day's hard walk from nowhere, or past where the creek talks back. The Tate place was beyond where the mountain gets hungry, which meant something specific to anyone who understood the ridge country's particular geography of dread. Margaret Crowley had driven Ridge Road every weekday for 4 years without incident. The 30-mile route from her cabin in Whisper Hollow to the state office building in Pikeville cut 40 minutes off her commute compared to the valley roads, and Margaret valued punctuality above most other virtues. She was a precise woman, a county clerk who kept immaculate records and arrived at work each morning at exactly 8:15, coffee still steaming in her thermos, ready to help citizens navigate the bureaucratic maze of property taxes and vehicle registrations. November 15th dawned gray and cold, with fog rolling off the Cumberland Plateau like smoke from a signal fire. Margaret's neighbor, Dolly Kempson, watched from her kitchen window as Margaret's blue Buick disappeared into the white wall of mist that had settled over the mountain. Dolly would later tell investigators she'd felt a chill watching those taillights vanish, though she couldn't explain why. The fog that morning was different, thicker, somehow more deliberate in how it clung to the ridgelines and pooled in the hollows. Local weather stations recorded visibility dropping to less than 10 feet in some areas, conditions that should have closed the mountain roads. But Tennessee's highway department operated on limited budgets and bureaucratic inertia, and Ridge Road remained open despite conditions that made driving treacherous. Margaret knew the road by heart. Every curve, every pothole, every place where the shoulder dropped away into darkness. She'd driven it in snow, ice, and summer thunderstorms that turned the asphalt into a river. Fog didn't frighten her. She had no reason to fear what waited in the white silence between the trees. Her car was found that afternoon by a Tennessee Department of Transportation crew checking road conditions. Engine cold, radio tuned to the AM station from Knoxville. Driver's seat adjusted to accommodate her 5'4" frame. Her coffee thermos sat undisturbed in the cup holder, still half full. Sheriff Bobby Hutchins had been investigating crimes for 12 years, first as a patrol officer in Knoxville, then as a detective specializing in rural cases where modern police work met mountain ways that dated back centuries. He thought he'd seen everything the backcountry could produce. Domestic violence that escalated to murder, moonshine operations that turned deadly, family feuds that smoldered across generations. But the scene at Ridge Road challenged his understanding of human behavior. The footprints formed a perfect circle around Margaret's abandoned Buick, as if whoever made them had been performing some kind of ritual. Bare feet, despite the November cold. 6 distinct sets of prints, ranging from what appeared to be a child's size to feet that would have required size 14, boots. The impressions in the soft earth showed calluses thick as shoe leather and toes splayed wide from years of walking rough ground without protection. What disturbed Hutchins most was the deliberate nature of the arrangement. These weren't random tracks left by people investigating an abandoned vehicle. They were positioned with the same precision he'd seen at crime scenes, staged by killers who wanted their work appreciated. Each set of prints faced inward toward the car, as if the owners had been studying Margaret like museum curators examining a new acquisition. The blood trail told its own story. Droplets leading from the driver's door into the laurel, spaced evenly like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale. But the spacing was wrong for someone walking. Too regular, too controlled. Someone had been carrying Margaret, bleeding, into the woods with careful steps that avoided disturbing the surrounding vegetation. Tennessee Bureau of Investigation Forensics would later confirm that the blood belonged to Margaret Crowley, but they found no other trace evidence at the scene. No fibers, no hair, no fingerprints on the car's surfaces. Whoever had taken her knew how to avoid leaving conventional clues. The silence that surrounded him. Hutchins called for backup and tracking dogs, but the fog made helicopter surveillance impossible, and the dogs lost the scent within 50 yards of the road. Whatever trail Margaret's captors had taken wound through terrain too rough for vehicles and too treacherous for anyone unfamiliar with the mountain's hidden geography. County records for the Tate family stretched back to 1847, though the documentation was fragmentary and often contradictory. Birth certificates listed children born to women who had no recorded marriage licenses. Death certificates for family members who appeared alive in later documents. Property transfers that made no legal sense. Trading land that couldn't be accurately surveyed for goods that defied conventional valuation. The family tree, such as it was, resembled something drawn by someone who didn't quite understand how family trees worked. Branches that folded back on themselves. Marriages between relatives that would have been illegal anywhere else in Tennessee. Children born to mothers who were listed as deceased in previous records. The Tate lineage read like a genetics experiment conducted by someone with only a partial understanding of heredity. Ezekiel Tate was listed as the family patriarch in the 1860s census, though his age was recorded as unknown and his birthplace as parts unknown. His wife, Mercy, appeared in the 1870 census with 7 children, then vanished from the records entirely. Her children, Caleb, Jedediah, Patience, Charity, Mordecai, Abner, and Silence, formed the foundation of the next generation. From an 1893 diary fragment found in the County Historical Society, the Tate children came to town today for supplies. Strange to see them in daylight. Patience has grown tall as a man and twice as strong. Silence still hasn't spoken a word, though she's near 20 now. What disturbed genealogists wasn't just the family's tendency toward inbreeding. Mountain communities had often been isolated enough to make such marriages common. But the way their records suggested longevity that defied medical explanation. Family members who should have died of old age continued appearing in documents decades past their expected lifespans. By the 1970s, the family had expanded to include over 40 individuals living in the remote homestead, though county officials had never conducted an accurate census of the compound. Social workers who attempted to visit the property returned with reports of children who fled into the woods at the first sight of strangers and adults who watched from the tree line with eyes that reflected light like nocturnal animals. Margaret Crowley was not the first person to vanish on Ridge Road. Sheriff's Department records dating back to 1945 documented 17 missing persons cases connected to the mountain route, though previous sheriffs had attributed most disappearances to ordinary hazards. Drivers who slid off the narrow road into ravines, hikers who became lost in the vast wilderness area that surrounded the ridgeline. But when Hutchins reviewed the files, he found patterns that suggested something more deliberate than accidental deaths. The missing were always traveling alone. Their vehicles were always found with keys in the ignition and personal belongings undisturbed. Weather conditions were invariably foggy or overcast, reducing visibility to dangerous levels. Most disturbing was the timing. Disappearances occurred in clusters separated by periods of 2 to 3 years, as if whoever was responsible operated according to some internal schedule that had nothing to do with opportunity or convenience. 7 people vanished between 1951 and 1953. 4 more between 1957 and 1958. 3 in 1962. 5 between 1968 and 1969. The victims shared few obvious characteristics beyond their solitary travel on Ridge Road. Men and women, young and old, local residents and travelers from distant states. But they were always alone, always vulnerable, always taken during conditions that made pursuit difficult. From a 1968 Tennessee Highway Patrol incident report. Vehicle abandoned mile marker 7, Ridge Road. Driver James Cullen, age 34, Louisville, Kentucky. Luggage intact. No sign of struggle. Investigation suspended due to lack of evidence. What would you do if you found your neighbor's names scattered throughout these missing persons files, but nobody in town wanted to discuss the pattern? If every attempt to organize a search party met with polite deflection and sudden scheduling, conflicts? If the only people willing to talk about the disappearances were drunk old-timers who spoke in riddles about mountain families that ain't quite right? Local authorities had established an unspoken protocol for handling Ridge Road cases. Conduct a perfunctory investigation, file the appropriate paperwork, and let the matter fade into administrative limbo. The alternative, acknowledging that something predatory lived in the mountains, would require resources the county didn't have and confrontations with local families that went back generations. 3 miles up Whisper Creek from the nearest logging road, the Tate family compound occupied a natural depression in the mountain that created its own microclimate. Protected from wind by ridgelines on three sides and watered by a spring that never ran dry, the bowl provided everything necessary for survival in terrain that challenged even experienced outdoorsmen. The homestead itself defied conventional architecture. Buildings constructed from materials that changed with the seasons. Timber frames expanded with stone and metal, scavenged from abandoned mining operations. Roof lines that followed no particular plan, but somehow shed water efficiently. Windows salvaged from demolished structures and arranged without regard for symmetry or conventional aesthetics. What appeared to be the main house was actually 3 or 4 separate structures, connected by enclosed walkways and covered passages that created a single sprawling complex. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys even in warm weather, suggesting food preservation activities that required constant fire. Gardens planted with vegetables that shouldn't have grown at that elevation, in soil that had been amended with materials that didn't bear close examination. The family lived according to rhythms that had little to do with conventional time. They moved primarily at dawn and dusk, during hunting hours when prey animals were most active. Children appeared and disappeared like wildlife, visible one moment and gone the next, melting into the forest with movements that seemed almost choreographed. 17 separate structures in various stages of completion or decay scattered throughout the bowl, connected by paths worn smooth by bare feet. Storage buildings that held supplies for winter isolation. Workshops where metal tools were maintained and sharpened. Smokehouses where meat was preserved using techniques that produced scents unfamiliar to anyone who hadn't lived in true wilderness. From a 1976 Tennessee Wildlife Commission report. Observed multiple subjects in remote area during deer survey. Family group appeared to be subsistence hunting using traditional methods. Subjects avoided contact with survey team. The most unsettling aspect of the compound wasn't its primitive construction or isolated location. It was how perfectly adapted it seemed to the mountain environment. Everything about the homestead suggested people who had spent generations learning to live as part of the ecosystem, rather than in opposition to it. Local folklore connected the Tate family's activities to lunar cycles, specifically the period around the harvest moon, when autumn fog settled into the mountain hollows and visibility on the ridge roads dropped to near zero. Old-timers claimed the family emerged from their compound only during these monthly hunting periods, using the cover of darkness and weather to conduct their grim business. November's harvest moon had risen full and blood red on the 13th, 2 days before Margaret Crowley's disappearance. Mountain people who understood such things locked their doors and avoided unnecessary travel during harvest moon nights, when the boundary between civilization and wilderness seemed most permeable. The fog that blanketed Ridge Road on November 15th was part of a weather pattern that meteorologists couldn't fully explain. A temperature inversion that trapped moisture at specific elevations, creating corridors of dense vapor that followed the mountain's contours like rivers of white blindness. Drivers entering these fog banks experienced complete disorientation, their normal visual reference points erased by conditions that made navigation almost impossible. For people who had spent their lives learning the mountain's moods, this fog was an ally. Bare feet could feel the texture of asphalt through their thick calluses, distinguishing between road surfaces and surrounding terrain with precision that shoes would have made impossible. Ears adapted to wilderness silence could detect approaching vehicles from miles away, estimating speed and direction from engine sounds that echoed off the ridgelines. The harvest moon hunt required patience that few modern people could understand. Hours spent motionless beside roads, waiting for the perfect combination of weather, timing, and vulnerable prey. Not every vehicle that passed during the fog would be selected. The hunters were particular about their choices, guided by criteria that had nothing to do with conventional predatory behavior. November 29, 1979. Tennessee Highway Patrol radio log. Multiple reports of figures walking on Ridge Road. Visibility poor. Unable to locate subjects. The selection process appeared almost ritualistic in its precision. Vehicles carrying multiple passengers were allowed to pass unmolested. Local residents whose faces were known to the watchers in the trees were permitted to continue their journeys. But solitary travelers, especially those from outside the immediate area, might find their path blocked by shapes that emerged from the white silence, with intentions that became clear only too late. Bobby Hutchins began his investigation into Margaret Crowley's disappearance by interviewing everyone who knew her routine. But he quickly discovered that asking direct questions about the Ridge Road disappearances triggered a kind of collective amnesia among local residents. People who had lived in Bledsoe County for generations suddenly claimed ignorance about events they had previously discussed openly. The pattern was consistent enough to be unmistakable. Citizens who approached him with information would lose their nerve when pressed for details. Witnesses who agreed to formal interviews would fail to appear at the scheduled time. Even Margaret's closest friends and co-workers developed sudden reluctance to discuss her travel habits or the circumstances surrounding her disappearance. Dolly Kempson, Margaret's neighbor who had watched her drive into the fog that morning, initially volunteered to help with the investigation. But when Hutchins arrived at her cabin for a follow-up interview, he found her packing belongings into cardboard boxes, preparing to move in with relatives in Murfreesboro. She claimed her decision had nothing to do with Margaret's disappearance, but her hands shook as she spoke, and her eyes kept drifting toward the windows that faced the ridgeline. The postmaster in Whisper Hollow, Earl Dawson, had worked for the Postal Service for 37 years and knew every family in the county by name. But when Hutchins asked about the Tate family's mailing address, Earl claimed he'd never delivered mail to anyone by that name. His assistant, a young woman who had grown up locally, contradicted him immediately, mentioning packages that were regularly left at the rural route terminus for pickup by those people up the creek. Earl silenced her with a look that could have frozen water. From Hutchins's notebook, dated November 20th, 1979. Everyone knows something. No one will say what. Local culture of silence stronger than fear of law enforcement. The most frustrating aspect of the investigation was how close the truth seemed to be. Conversations would begin with promising leads, mentions of strange lights on the mountain, reports of unusual sounds echoing through the hollows, but would invariably trail off into uncomfortable silence when Hutchins tried to gather specific details. What emerged from these incomplete interviews was a picture of a community that had learned to coexist with something dangerous by pretending it didn't exist. Hutchins found the breakthrough he needed, not in witness testimony, but in bureaucratic records that had accumulated over decades of administrative neglect. The county courthouse basement contained filing cabinets dating back to the 1800s, documents that had been stored without proper cataloging and largely forgotten by successive generations of clerks and officials. Among these papers were livestock permits that made no sense, applications for transporting large game during seasons when hunting was prohibited, signed by various members of the Tate family and routinely approved by county officials who seemed to understand some unwritten protocol about avoiding questions. Purchase orders for quantities of salt and preservation chemicals that far exceeded what any normal household would require for food storage. Most disturbing were the medical examiner's reports from neighboring counties, cases that had been transferred to Bledsoe County jurisdiction and then quietly filed without follow-up investigation. Bodies found in remote areas, decomposed beyond normal identification procedures, showing evidence of systematic dismemberment that was attributed to animal scavenging rather than human activity. The pattern became clear when Hutchins arranged the documents chronologically. Every 2 to 3 years, during periods that corresponded with clusters of missing persons reports, medical examiners in surrounding counties would discover human remains that exhibited identical characteristics. Bones that had been carefully cleaned, arranged in patterns that suggested ritualistic behavior, accompanied by evidence of food preparation techniques that were never fully documented in the official reports. From a 1974 coroner's report, Campbell County. Skeletal remains show evidence of systematic processing. Recommend transfer to Bledsoe County Authority per standing agreement. This standing agreement was never formalized in any document Hutchins could locate, but it represented a bureaucratic conspiracy of willful ignorance that spanned multiple jurisdictions and several decades. Officials throughout East Tennessee had developed an informal protocol for handling certain types of evidence. Transfer it to Bledsoe County and let Sheriff Hutchins's predecessors deal with the implications. The weight of official complicity. Armed with warrants based on the documentary evidence, Hutchins organized a joint operation with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation to search the Tate family compound. The raid was planned for December 3rd, exactly 3 weeks after Margaret Crowley's disappearance, using state resources that included tracking specialists and search and rescue teams experienced in difficult terrain. The expedition began before dawn, with teams approaching the compound from 3 different directions to prevent escape through the network of deer paths that connected the bowl to the wider wilderness. But when they reached the coordinates provided by old survey maps, they found only empty forest where the homestead should have been. The natural bowl was there, the spring, the cleared areas where buildings should have stood, the terraced gardens where vegetables had been growing as recently as November. But every structure had vanished as completely as if they had never existed. No foundations remained, no debris from hasty demolition, no evidence that humans had ever occupied the site for more than temporary camping. What unsettled the search teams most was how quickly the forest was reclaiming the space. Vegetation that should have taken months or years to establish had already begun covering the areas where buildings had stood just weeks earlier. New growth so dense it looked deliberate, as if the mountain itself was erasing evidence of human habitation. The search dogs detected scent trails throughout the bowl, but the trails led nowhere. They would follow a track for hundreds of yards before it simply stopped, as if whoever left it had vanished into thin air. Human scents mixed with others that the handlers couldn't identify. Odors that made the dogs nervous and reluctant to continue tracking. From TBI Case File 779-115. Extensive search of target area reveals no evidence of permanent structures or recent human habitation. Mission suspended due to dangerous terrain and deteriorating weather conditions. The failure of the raid represented more than tactical disappointment. It suggested that the Tate family possessed knowledge of the mountain that went beyond normal outdoor skills. They hadn't simply evacuated their compound. They had erased it so completely that investigators began to question whether it had ever existed. The discovery that changed everything came from an unexpected source. Margaret Crowley's sister, driving from Nashville to collect her belongings, stopped at a gas station in Crossville and found a postcard addressed to her in Margaret's handwriting. The postcard had been mailed from Pikeville on November 16th, the day after Margaret's disappearance. The message was brief. "Sarah, something wonderful has happened. I found the family I was meant to belong to. Don't worry about me. I'm finally home." M. The handwriting was definitely Margaret's, confirmed by comparison with documents from the county clerk's office where she worked. But the message itself contradicted everything her sister knew about Margaret's personality and beliefs. Margaret had been an intensely private person who avoided social gatherings and had never expressed interest in finding alternative communities or unconventional living arrangements. More troubling was the postmark. If Margaret had mailed the card in Pikeville on November 16th, she would have had to escape from whoever abducted her, travel to town, purchase a postcard, write the message, and mail it, all without contacting law enforcement or returning to work. The scenario made no logical sense. When Hutchins examined the postcard under magnification, he found details that suggested the message had been written under duress. The handwriting was Margaret's, but the pressure applied to the pen was inconsistent, as if her hand had been guided or constrained during the writing process. Several words showed signs of hesitation, as if the writer had been unsure about what to say. Most disturbing was what the postcard didn't mention. Margaret's car, her job, her established life in Whisper Hollow. None of these were acknowledged in a message that suggested she had voluntarily abandoned everything to join an unspecified family. The tone was wrong, too cheerful, too definitive for someone who had just made a life-altering decision. From the Crossville Postmaster's records. Unusual postal activity November 16th. Multiple postcards deposited by unidentified subjects during overnight hours. The postcard represented a new element in the investigation, evidence that Margaret might still be alive, but under circumstances that made rescue increasingly unlikely with each passing day. December brought early snow to the Cumberland Plateau, conditions that typically isolated the mountain communities for weeks at a time. But instead of the quiet that usually accompanied winter storms, residents of Bledsoe County reported unusual activity in the high country. Lights moving through the forest at night, sounds that carried farther than they should in the thin air, smoke rising from areas where no permanent structures were supposed to exist. The reports came from hunters, loggers, and others whose work required them to travel the back roads during conditions when most sensible people stayed home. Multiple witnesses described seeing groups of people moving through the snow without apparent destination, following paths that weren't marked on any map and didn't correspond to known trails. What made these sightings particularly unsettling was the apparent indifference to weather conditions that would have challenged experienced outdoorsmen. The observed individuals wore minimal clothing despite temperatures that regularly dropped below freezing, moved with confidence through terrain that was treacherous in good weather, and seemed to navigate by senses that didn't rely on conventional landmarks. The winter gathering, for that was how local people began referring to the phenomenon, appeared to center around the area where the Tate compound had been located. Search teams who attempted to investigate found their equipment failing in ways that couldn't be attributed to normal cold weather problems. Compasses spun wildly, radios produced only static, and vehicle engines that had worked perfectly in town refused to start once the teams reached the mountain access roads. From a December 15th emergency services log, multiple reports of missing persons in remote areas, search and rescue operations hampered by equipment malfunctions and deteriorating weather. The pattern suggested that whatever had driven the Tate family to temporarily abandon their compound was temporary. They were returning and bringing others with them. They were multiplying. On December 20th, 2 days before the winter solstice, Bobby Hutchins received a visitor who would force him to confront the full scope of what he was investigating. The man who appeared at the sheriff's department gave his name as Dr. Henry Blackwood, claiming to be an anthropologist from the University of Tennessee who had been studying isolated mountain communities for over 20 years. Dr. Blackwood brought documentation that confirmed Hutchins's worst suspicions about the Tate family, genealogical research that traced their lineage back to European communities that had been expelled from their home regions for practicing cannibalism during times of famine, ethnographic studies of Appalachian groups that had maintained pre-agricultural survival strategies long after conventional farming became established. Most disturbing, psychological profiles of individuals who had been incorporated into such groups through processes that could only be described as conversion. The conversation that followed lasted through the night, with Dr. Blackwood explaining cultural practices that challenged every assumption Hutchins had made about human nature. Cannibalism, he explained, wasn't necessarily pathological behavior. In certain environmental and social contexts, it represented a rational adaptation to resource scarcity. Communities that practiced it developed elaborate rituals and social structures that made such behavior not only acceptable, but necessary for group survival. What made the Tate family unique wasn't their cannibalistic practices. Indigenous cultures throughout the world had incorporated human flesh into their diets during crisis periods. What was unprecedented was their success in maintaining and expanding such practices in modern America, using the isolation of Appalachian geography to create a sustainable predatory lifestyle that had persisted for over a century. From Dr. Blackwood's field notes, the subject group represents a successful adaptation of European cannibalistic traditions to North American wilderness conditions. Their recruitment methods suggest sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation and social isolation techniques. Margaret Crowley's postcard, Dr. Blackwood explained, was evidence of a conversion process that typically took several weeks to complete. New members were gradually introduced to the group's practices through psychological conditioning that broke down their existing identity and replaced it with loyalty to the clan structure. By the time they were capable of writing messages like Margaret's postcard, they had already crossed psychological boundaries that made return to normal society impossible. The choice facing Hutchins was stark: accept that Margaret and others like her were beyond rescue, or attempt an intervention that would likely result in the deaths of both victims and law enforcement personnel. Hutchins made his decision on the morning of December 21st. Working with Tennessee Bureau of Investigation resources and federal agents who specialized in cult intervention, he organized a winter assault on the Tate compound, designed to end their predatory activities permanently. The operation would involve military-grade equipment and personnel trained for hostile environmental conditions. But when the task force reached the bowl where the compound had been located, they found evidence that the family had anticipated their arrival. Structures that had been rebuilt since the previous raid showed signs of recent abandonment. Fires had been extinguished, supplies moved, pathways obscured with techniques that demonstrated intimate knowledge of wilderness survival. Most disturbing was what they found in the areas that had served as food preparation and storage facilities. Human remains arranged in patterns that suggested ritualistic consumption practices spanning generations. Bone fragments that showed evidence of systematic processing techniques. Preserved materials that confirmed the worst implications of Dr. Blackwood's research. The task force also discovered something unexpected: evidence that the Tate family's recruitment activities had been expanding. Personal effects belonging to missing persons from multiple states, suggesting that their hunting territory extended far beyond the Bledsoe County area. Documentation indicating contact with similar groups in other isolated regions, creating a network of communities that shared resources and survival strategies. Margaret Crowley's final journal, hidden in a cache that suggested she had retained enough autonomy to document her experiences, provided the most chilling evidence of what conversion to the clan involved. Her handwriting grew increasingly erratic as the entries progressed, documenting psychological changes that transformed her from a victim into a willing participant in practices that would have horrified her just weeks earlier. From Margaret's final entry, dated December 18th. I understand now why they chose me. The hunger isn't just for flesh. It's for belonging to something larger than the artificial communities we built in the valleys. Up here, we remember what it means to be truly human. The task force recovered enough evidence to document the scope of the Tate family's activities over multiple decades, but they found no living members of the clan to arrest or prosecute. Like smoke dispersing in mountain wind, the family had vanished into wilderness that offered countless hiding places for people who understood its secrets. Bobby Hutchins resigned as sheriff of Bledsoe County 3 months after the winter raid, unable to reconcile what he had learned about the Tate family with his understanding of law enforcement's role in protecting society. The case files were sealed and transferred to federal jurisdiction, where they joined similar documentation from other regions where isolated communities had developed survival strategies that challenged conventional definitions of civilization. Margaret Crowley was officially declared dead, though her body was never recovered. Her sister inherited her property and sold it to developers who built vacation homes for wealthy families from Nashville and Knoxville. The new residents occasionally reported unusual sounds echoing from the ridgelines, but these complaints were attributed to wildlife activity and generally ignored by local authorities. The Ridge Road remains open, though Tennessee Department of Transportation now posts warnings about dangerous weather conditions and advises travelers to use alternate routes during periods of low visibility. Missing persons reports from the area have declined significantly since 1979, though it's unclear whether this represents improved safety or better concealment of predatory activities. Dr. Henry Blackwood published his research on isolated Appalachian communities, but academic journals rejected his sections dealing with cannibalistic practices as unsubstantiated speculation. He returned to the Cumberland Plateau region several times over the following decades, claiming to be conducting follow-up studies, but these expeditions yielded no publishable results. Local residents still warn against traveling the ridge roads during fog, though younger generations treat these warnings as quaint superstitions left over from a more primitive era. They don't know about the footprints that still appear occasionally on the soft earth beside remote mountain highways, bare feet that circle abandoned vehicles with the same patient precision their ancestors used to evaluate prey. The mountain remembers everything. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.